Didn't say anything to. But back to this. Now, the reason we're just going to look at the intro paragraphs and how that's why I also give you guys a template of an intro paragraph, because I want to kind of, set you up for success. I don't want to make you feel like, oh, I have to write it like this. It's like, no, this is an idea. This, take some time to like, okay, I see these are the parts of the paragraph. What can I emulate in my own work that does that too? The way to do, if you do that, you might just be closer to meeting that A on the rubric as a standard. But I also think that a good intro paragraph sets you up for success. Now, I will say, as someone who often writes her introduction last, that's like kind of messed up. You're like, gosh, you got to write that first. Not technically. Think of the intro of two ways, right? You're telling the person where you're going, but like sometimes you don't always know where you're going till you get there. That's completely legitimate. And some people get like super psyched out by looking at a blank page, and I got to start at the beginning. Start where it's easiest to start. But when you think of, hopefully, before you start writing, you guys have all started maybe with some kind of an outline. Your outline usually has the key pieces you hope to cover in your essay. I mean, the recording I'm going to put up, maybe it's how I write, but nowadays with all the people who like type things, I can't believe I have students who've written papers on phones. I know that's real, and I'm just laughing because like I'm not old enough. Like phones fucking existed when I was in college. Let it be known. But I lived Dartmouth. The cellular data didn't work till like I graduated, and I also was poor. So I had a Virgin mobile phone till like senior year of college. So like the idea of synthesizing on a device I didn't even have access to at the time, but also that would be so fucked to have to do it on a phone screen. But your outlines and your intros, I personally do a lot of dictation. I love how a lot of softwares have been better at that. But when you're thinking of your paper and you're doing your outline, something that could be helpful as you work on your introduction is to just explain it to yourself in a voice memo. Obviously, usually you're probably a little more conversational when you're talking like that, so you'll go and edit those parts out. But in both of these essays, you see a really good example of just kind of telling the reader where I'll be taking you over the next couple minutes. And in the most accessible way, like that in that essay, you're going to get a chance to go into detail with anything you mention. But the introduction is not the place to do that. Instead, it's just to, I don't know. I feel like you're getting in the car with someone. You want them to know that you want them to know they're going to take you somewhere cool. They're going to be a good driver. You trust them. The intro is your chance to do that. Now, I did want to point out though, it's really hard. No one, I don't think, gets a 30 out of 30 ever. On the first essay, there's just no way. You don't know me. And not to be like, we actually go out of our way to find that point. If someone did, I'd probably let it be known. But as I was looking at these papers, I was like, why? Where is the point? Like, because these were such good papers. The other one, too long and that's where we struggle when we try to tell good stories. And I will say, if you ever have any comments from me on your paper, and I'll usually outline it and be like, sentence 4 lines long, or your paragraph. Look at this bad boy. This is a fire intro paragraph, but it is also one entire typed page. I think this kind of messed her up a little. This, she got a little screwed out of a line or two. But if you're ever looking at your paper and there's a couple ways to check yourself, let's say we've written it and then I like to write on single space and then double it. Makes me feel like I really worked hard when I do that. But let's say we've done that and you're looking at it double spaced and you're like, I have a sentence here. This probably applies in single space too. But if you have a sentence it's 4 lines or longer, run-on sentence. Doesn't care what it's about. Unless like half that is a really gross parenthetical citation with like 16 people involved, probably need to think about how to break that sentence up. That goes with paragraphs too. These are, if you have run-on sentences and run-on paragraphs, that's actually a good sign. It means you are getting it, you're telling a good story. And honestly, if you're talking to someone, we can have all the run-on sentences and paragraphs we want. That's the best part about orating. But when you're writing, you can't go that long because probably there's somewhere you could edit, or maybe you've got too many things going on in that one sentence or that one paragraph. So that being said, when you look at these two examples, know that somewhere they missed a point. In this one, I would say that that was probably a problem throughout it, even though she did a really good use of it. You want to make sure that your space is allocated in a way that shows you did the reading, but that you're not just copying and pasting huge amounts of other people's words. And that's also sometimes where you see a paper go too long. That wasn't the case in either of these instances, but there are a few ways to kind of like internally check your paper that we also do that when we're going through. You know, you don't grade it on the first pass. Usually you're kind of reading through just to see what the person's saying. Then you go back through and you actually assess and critique and there is, at the same time though, when we get to see a lot of essays, those are kind of the trends that if you're shooting for a really strong essay, make sure you do your best to stick to the page limit, to be careful of run-on sentences, run-on paragraphs, but to also be specific when you're drawing on your in-class stuff and the anecdotes or the experiences that you're trying to connect to them to in the real world. And as you look at these examples as well, what I loved is they both did a good job of drawing on their experiences personally while also being able to back it up. Now, part of this storytelling is to draw on your own experiences. But let's say, in honor of this week, we wanted to write about the school back home. You know, where I live, we all went to the same high school. We all went to the same middle school, kind of. Like there was smaller towns that had their own middle school, but in the actual like town where all the schools came together in high school, there was very clearly a poor grade school and a rich grade school. And you know, sometimes you'll hear parents brag. My mom would brag about how we lived on the wrong side of town and probably could have went to the poor school, but she went out of her way to make sure we went to Dow's Prairie. We also know there's been cases in the media where moms have been arrested and sentenced because they wrote an address that allowed their student or their child to go to a better school. And so these are ways you can kind of draw on personal experiences and then go and find something in the real world that lets you support that. And so as you're looking at these examples, don't feel like your experiences aren't worth bringing up, but then go that extra mile. A B paper is going to tell a great story too, but they might not back it up. An A paper tells a great story and it has teeth, as I like to say. Do you guys have questions about essays or where, I don't know. I'm hoping you guys have written an essay before, but at minimum, you're learning something as you write this one now. I'm gonna check in on Zoom. Okay, and also I will say writing's deeply personal. So if you're like, I have a question I don't want to ask right now in front of everyone, makes sense. Feel free to send it in the chat, follow up. We have office hours. I'll be scheduling some in-person office hours, but as a reminder, they're this week on Thursdays after class. So if you have some questions right now that you want to save till then, I'd love to hear them. And between now and Thursday, you'll see these essays posted, as well as maybe just like a hit list of these points that I've given you. And for anyone who's been in my class before, and you're like, I know this essay is different, but I want to make sure I don't kind of repeat yourself is one thing. I'd love you to repeat yourself. I don't mind. Plagiarism can happen if you copy and paste your old essay into this one. But if you're talking about something that's kind of similar, like how do you make it different enough? So I'll be preparing some remarks on that. But if you personally have questions about where your individual essay, I'd love to answer those one-on-one. Awesome possum. Let's see here. So we are going to now, like I said, today and next time is about, oh, that's right, the corners don't work. Urban inequality and the role of schools. Don't show this again. Excellent. Now, I think I start with some brevity. Yeah, don't forget your essay is due. We just talked about it extensively. Now let's cue this baddie up. Is this the right one? I don't think so. It is that one. Okay. Okay. Zoom land, you should be seeing this, and we're hoping this is going to play for everybody. So I just want to open it up with a little humor from Abbott Elementary.
Oh yeah, I can help you make your video. Really? Yes, this is what I do. Well, you're also a principal, so. Yeah, but this is my art. I write, I edit, I direct, I do the music, I lip sync. Because of me, when people say that their favorite director is that Ava lady, somebody else gotta be like, which one?
Well, maybe you can just give me a few tips, maybe help build on what I already have.
Ooh, let me see. What is this, an iPhone now? Like a Walkman. I don't know about this. That's before my time. Ooh.
Well, I'm not on social media like that, so I don't have a lot of experience with
Quality control. I'm kidding. She know I'm playing.
That's why
I can get you a lot of views, and that's gonna mean a lot of supplies. But I'm gonna need complete creative control.
What does that mean?
I'm gonna take some photos, do a little video, and then I'll do my thing in post. Can you twerk? I look like we can, but I could be wrong.
Now, why on earth am I showing a video that teacher's twerking? In lots of ways. Has anyone ever seen Abbott Elementary? Open? Yep. I highly recommend it if you haven't. Also, I was like, I knew Quinta back when she was on BuzzFeed. You guys were babies then. But I was like, she is amazing. And there's so many amazing people on that show. But it pokes fun essentially at life as a public school teacher in a school district where resources are spread pretty thin. And depending on what kind of school you went to, this may or may not resonate. I come from a rural area where in a very introspective way, I learned when I made it to college that had I been, I don't want to be like a regular poor kid in most other places, I would probably have not wound up where I was because I had had access to education that wasn't as deeply tied to my family's socioeconomic status. Was I the poor kid in Gate or, the poor kid who went to the math competition and, yeah, but I still got to do those things and go those places. And by and large, the schools we have access to in the United States are fundamentally tied to the resources of not just our household, but actually, if we'll remember, neighborhoods being so important to this whole thing. Schools, neighborhoods, the funding base, these things go together. And that is not necessarily a have to scenario, but that is, at least when we think of America and culture, the way we do things obviously is very important because there's something called path dependence, right? So the way the United States has traditionally funded education, public schools, has been at the level of the local. Now, does anyone know why public school, at least if we're going to believe in America and its mythologies, which are currently burning, but that's my other class. What is so special about public education in the United States? What could one say? What would make it special? Has anyone ever heard this before? There's a couple of reasons. I would accept any of them. Check in on Zoom. Like, do all countries? Is that it? Go ahead. Yes. What if we went all the way back to like the beginning of the country? Let's say, like, historically speaking, why might public education be important? Or novel, even. I never know what the background is in the room, but I always forget before I did the stuff we learned about in this class. I spent all of college learning about education inequality. And that was, I always say that's my first love. Let's see, we've got to answer segregation. Yes, that's a layer there. So I'm going to go even further back and just give you a couple tidbits. So we always have to remember that there's a difference between the reality of America over time, but we also can think of America as a idea and a sentiment. And not to be on my soapbox, but like actually one of the things that kills me the most about how America is showing up in the world right now is that right now, all the things that we shove down the throats of others is horseshit compared to what we actually do here. As an Indian, I'll be the first to say it. As a genocide survivor, descendant of genocide survivors, I will say that. But it's also quite damning because the last time there was a world war, it's been a while, but I actually believe, even though then too, we weren't so good and we were self-serving in our own ways, and especially here the most, there was a time when America did represent something that meant an ideal that people were willing to stand behind because it was the only place in the world where those things had been enshrined in a good way. And this would include public education insofar as democracy requires an informed electorate, that we need people to be able to read so that they can vote. That is in many ways where the idea of public education stems from in the United States, and why it was kind of an ideal for the very early, let's say, first century of our existence, because actually in a great majority of the world, you had to be someone who had resources to go to public school or to go to school. Public school itself was almost like an American invention. The idea that we would have K through 12 education for everyone, and that you actually, your parents could be jailed from keeping you from schools, that your parents could be killed and you could be taken to a school, different, but boarding schools. Like, let's just say schooling is pretty entrenched in the United States history. And in some ways, it's ironic that it is so important to the apparatus of democracy at large, but it's also one of the areas where you see the whole states' rights and I think federalism ethos pop up. Does anyone know what these things would refer to? Any gov majors or poli sci? What do they call it on campus? Is it political science here? Anyone do that? What is federalism or states' rights? I think these are two sides of the same coin. Anybody? It's okay. I don't know these things often either. It's about like, what can the federal government do and what is in the rights of the states. I don't want to be like, this shit is actually mad important right now. So if you don't know it, let me tell you more. Yes, okay, so federalism is, if we think of the federal government and the responsibilities of the federal government, there is different interpretations when we think of how we use the Constitution. But even so, like, where do we draw the lines of like what is under federal purview and what is meant? There's no federal Department of Motor Vehicles, right? California, DMV, every DMV is its own state thing. Schools, even though there is a universal federal expectation and need for schooling, it has always fundamentally been a state responsibility and a local initiative. Why this super matters right now, it's actually giving me chills to even think about it, is that the Department of Education, that was one of the things, I won't even fucking say, he will not be named, man. We're living in Harry Potter right fucking now, okay? He's come back alive. There's people, I don't know who Umbridge is, but anyway, geeked out for a second. Back to the metaphor. Department of Education, it's fucked up that he's even talking about it. What's even more fucked up is somehow we're all still going to own student loans, but they're going to close the Department of Education. Yeah, fucking right. That's another fight for another day. But in some ways where they will have slightly more ability to make that rhetorical argument is this little linchpin that they have. Department of Education is not a federal responsibility, that they're going to give that power back to the states. And one of the points that came up in the chat that is important was segregation. We had other kind of comments in the room. So the standardization, segregation, we can think of why it's important not to leave things to just states. that there is an incentive for there to be some kind of uniform system, at least for some kind of equity's sake, but also for accountability's sake, if we know there are inequities going on or even abuses, right? So in this week's reading, we kind of learn about the mechanics of all that. And you learn a deep dive into school funding. And essentially, while, there is differences across the United States, it would be pretty accurate to say that most school districts operate under a funding model that is inherently tied to the property taxes of their immediately surrounding area. That is by design, because we have left this to the local and the state to fund. And while there is some funding that comes down from the federal level, a great majority of school services and resources are provided by the state. And then it is supplemented by the actual tax base that comes from that area. Now, one could imagine the argument that stands that those resources should stay in that place, or at least the children should have access to that resource base through their schooling. But by that same token, we know by what we learned about over the last several weeks about how there's such huge difference by neighborhood of affluence, and how there's a concentration effect that whether it's good or bad, it's going to keep going like that. Like there's some incentive then maybe to provide some kind of equity or some safeguards, because in the event that we just let the system go as designed, there will inevitably be extreme pockets of wealth and extreme have-nots that are going to fundamentally shape the education experience. So in the United States, if we think of this being the paradigm of how we fund schools, we have to also think about ways we've tried to intervene on that paradigm itself, or to try and impact the outcomes that are impacted by student funding, even if it's not actually, I don't want to say American policy loves to treat the smoke and not the fire. So as much as we know that resources are deeply tied to place and all the mechanisms that structure inequality therein, there have been attempts to try and mix this up a little. And this would largely be reminiscent of, I'm gonna say something I think in a second that you guys all lived under, which is wild. But the process of linking student performance as measured by test scores, and then these standardized tests having meaning beyond the performance of said student, this is also a paradigm in education that doesn't necessarily have to be, but raise your hand if you completed a STAR test when you're growing up. That's what they still call them, right? STAR tests every April, usually, for some reason, that's when the teachers would give you granola bars and be nice to you and let you I guess, go to school in a nice place. But that's because we needed these tests to look real good, right? And I was before No Child Left Behind, which is a huge paradigm shift in trying to intervene in American education that really did not go over so well, because it didn't get at the underlying mechanisms. And instead, it really cemented this idea that student performance, can be measured accurately and appropriately via test scores, which is in itself a huge assumption. But then further, that these tests can be standardized and that we can then use that as some kind of accountability metric for the school, and in turn impact their funding and other resources accordingly. Now, has anyone ever heard about any of this on the news or anything? Or even just growing up? Who remembers No Child Left Behind? It was passed in 2001. We're going to go back a second, but fun fact. Some of you may have been born after 2001, maybe even most of you. So that means it did impact you, whether you knew it or not. But I just want to shout out a couple paradigms that I think we won't get a chance to get into today, but I think if we're going to call out a couple things about how we do schooling in the United States and how it really locks us into our ability to even think of solutions, we also have to point out the fact that we are currently in a paradigm of fixed models versus growth, as in, I'm going to measure your performance A, B, C, DF, that, you know, it's a fixed stand that I hold everyone up to? Or what if I decided to instead say, okay, you came into the class, you wrote an essay this well, you knew this much about X subjects, and I hope that by the end of this, you'll have gotten up to here. And you know what? Maybe the up to here looks different for every student, but to me, it's more important that you grew over the course of that rather than met some arbitrary set standard that was fixed before you were even there. This is also a very particular way to assess students or teachers or schools. And we have to think back that this is all based within arguably a huge deficit model, that we have thought of schooling or the ways to impact schooling through a scarcity kind of framework where we only have this much and we're only going to give schools this much. And now we got to decide, oh, we're going to use that little bit of slice. But then it also means that, like, we're not looking at the things that people or structures do well. We're looking at what they're not doing enough of. And that trickles down to students. It's also when we think of, for example, I started the class with my example of my work on hypersurveillance versus invisibility when someone is actually hurt. And a lot of my work on missing and murdered stems from the inherent fact that they are too busy counting the ways we die to ensure that we live. And by not worrying about how to encourage our life and to collect data on that, we, of course, should not expect this system to be able to do anything but kill us as designed. And when you focus on one area over another, that's what you see. And so hopefully in my work, I can change what they see so that they'll see us as something worth living and keeping as such. But it's also when you think of the critiques that have been made about public school or like charter schools or different kinds of schooling models, a lot of it, whether, you know, some charter schools go bust, some of them are like flashes in the pan. School choice can sometimes be like a conservative, like a Trojan horse for other things. But if we considered schools as a way to enhance the inherent strengths of children, what would that be like? Like, that's just like a different orientation towards education and skill building than what we might currently have. And if you'll remember, when we touched on culture, cultural capital came up, and the idea that schools aren't just this thing that, like, oh, it's so cool, America gives school to everyone. French scholars have pointed out it's actually hugely important to the settler colonial project to socialize us to certain expectations and to track us into living a certain way. And schools is how that is done. Now, as I said, school funding is this discussion for today, but what impacts school funding? Now, traditionally, as I said, it's impacted by the resources of the surrounding area. In the No Child Left Behind era, and kind of a little since, they actually, so it's one of the most recent federal interventions into public schools. And unlike previous interventions, it had tied funding directly to student performance. But remember, student performance as measured in a very specific way. And in doing this, it was kind of the thought that, oh, well, we'll incentivize, you know, school performance. Students will do better because their teachers will be doing better. Schools will be working harder, and they're going to have to work harder because if they want the resources they need, and if they want more, it's going to all come down to how their students do. Now, I think one could say that if you were to do this and you gave like a huge amount of resources for schools to like get their shit together and then, you know, start the race or whatever, shoot the gun, the race could maybe be somewhat fair, but they really enacted this huge change in expectations with very, very real consequences without any associated infrastructure, funding, support, etc. And so if you do something like that, if you all of a sudden become punitive or institute something that you don't have any other support for, you know, you're almost kind of blaming the victim by further penalizing poor performing schools in low income areas. That is arguably exactly what this did. But you can't blame the very real, you know, the idea that we had these inequalities in schools had been really brought to the public conscious in the 90s, and they started to pick up traction in the late 90s, early 2000s to intervene. And No Child Left Behind really left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. Every Student Succeeds Act is a more recent example. And unlike that focus on funding and test scores and really linking those things together, if I'm not mistaken, Every Student Succeeds is what ushered in the Common Core curriculum. That they tried to instead look at the content and see if maybe we can just standardize. If everyone can get these same building blocks, then, you know, that's how we will assess performance or even honor or penalize performance. I'll save the critiques for Common Core because it was somewhat after my time, but this is kind of a chronology of how these things take place. But I want to give you some content from when No Child Left Behind was happening. If we can find the mouse. I think we're gonna watch the whole thing, but
President and Congress have finally agreed on a new education law, one that aims to shift some of the federal government's influence over 100,000 public schools.
A Christmas miracle, a bipartisan bill signing right here.
President Obama praised the new bill called the Every Student Succeeds Act as he prepared to sign it into law at the White House. It still requires annual testing of students between 3rd and 8th grade, as well as once during high school. But unlike the prior law signed by President George W. Bush in 2002, it does not give the federal government power to impose penalties on underperforming schools. President Obama, who had waived those penalties but had backed many features of the law for years, acknowledged the shortcomings of No Child Left Behind.
It didn't always consider the specific needs of each community. It led to too much testing during classroom time. It often forced schools and school districts into cookie cutter reforms that didn't always produce the kinds of results that we wanted to see.
The new law passed with unusually large bipartisan margins in the Senate and the House, a point made yesterday by one of its sponsors, Republican Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee.
Not many things that's important passed the United States Senate 85-12. And this is a big Christmas present from the Senate and the House, and it's going down to the president. And I hope he wraps a big red ribbon around it and sends it out to 100 million students and 3.4 million teachers in 100,000 public schools.
States and school districts will now have more responsibility for judging how schools are doing and how to utilize testing. Teacher evaluations, long a subject of intense debate, will not necessarily be tied to tests. But there remain many questions about the practical impact. Will states take action when needed? And will some districts return to a time of ignoring the needs of struggling and minority students? So let's take a closer look at what this law changes and some of those questions and criticisms of it. Allison Klein is a reporter with Education Week, an organization we collaborate with on education stories. She was at the White House today for the president's signing. Allison Klein, thank you for being here. So what are the main ways that this new bill is different from the old one?
So as you mentioned at the top, this new law would really broaden the authority of states when it comes to turning around low performing schools, evaluating teachers, and deciding what exactly to hold schools accountable for. States, as you said, will still have to test students in grades 3 through 8. And once in high school, but they'll have more say over how much those tests count in gauging a school's performance.
So is that a significant change in the testing requirement, the testing that's going to go on?
Yeah, the testing will continue, but schools will also be,
I can't remember if we watched the rest, but I'm gonna, for the sake of time, we've got other better videos. That is, I was like, we had other fish to fry. I would say, like, if we think of all of the Affordable Care Act legislation and kind of healthcare policy, I feel like you all are very young in the world still. And so the education kind of setting the policy tone, that was what we were talking about before healthcare, honestly. And maybe, I mean, I was someone, I'm going to keep the lights low because we have more videos, just a handful. But if you get curious, I would say that the school week is the week we see a lot of papers written about. And so definitely lean into your experience. But if you're like, gosh, I just am learning a lot about how my school was either like this or not like this, like these are some of the benchmarks in time that kind of shaped your academic experience. Because if you went to school at any point in the last 25 years, you were essentially taking place in what will probably be described as one of the most innovative times in education in American history, but also a time where like a lot of things were tried and a lot of things did not work. And I think some would say that we find ourselves with very similar patterns and outcomes, despite a great number of policy interventions and changes. So like I said, this for me was something I was passionate about early on, because it was also, I started to see how, I'm at an Ivy League school at the time, and I'm realizing that my background is relatively unique in the span of everyone who came here, and that I'm learning in class that, like, statistically, I shouldn't be here. And that these are the things in my life that were somewhat different, maybe that shaped my path. But to be able to use the sociological imagination, which we don't have a day on in this class, but that is a concept in sociology where you get that chance to kind of orient yourself in time and space and history and understand how your journey is shaped by things above and beyond your personal choices. Education is one of those first institutions. And at this point in your lives, probably the most impactful institution. Now, what does all this mean for student performance? Because let's say we've tried tinkering with stuff, and yeah, it hasn't really changed much except for maybe the qualitative experience that students experience as well as teachers. And what is also quite damning is that if we know that the huge deficits in schools or the inequities across schools were a driver of the poor student outcomes, one would imagine that increasing spending, right, would improve those outcomes. That seems like a pretty straightforward process. Now, I think we can all imagine that schools, yes, have certain basic needs that absolutely have to be met, and there's no way to get around that. But what's unfortunate is that even in areas where they really were able to either equalize funding or just really pour in funding to those places where previously they had not had that same like base level as peer schools, that it didn't actually necessarily mean better student performance, at least as measured by standardized tests. And we always have to remember that any conversations really in education are usually tied to how they're measuring anything, which is test scores. And if you have a problem with test scores, you have a problem with a great number of the kind of conclusions made from them. So if it's not the funding, what else could be at play? And that's where we see teacher quality really start to become a big part of the conversation, and how teacher quality is something that, good teachers don't grow on trees. They are hard to come by, and it is something that people can gain the skill and work on that skill. But for every, good teacher, you might have 10 okay teachers. And what sucks is like a student could have one really good teacher, and that could like change a life. But there's no equal distribution of really good teachers. And actually, can anyone think, this is also kind of a way back historical fact, but if we think of teacher quality being inherently a problem of supply and demand in some ways. We know that we have a huge demand for good teachers because we have a huge public school system. But then we don't have the supply. We got a lot of people that can teach, but good teachers are not in high supply. Like what would have changed perhaps in the last 100 years that would have impacted our supply of teachers, particularly K through 12 teachers? Go ahead. Pay, part of it, yes. What would pay kind of be connected to a little? So would you say we're paying people more or? Mm-hmm. So that I see what you're saying. We don't have good teachers because we don't pay them enough. Yes, very much part of it. So what about when more people were teachers? What is something that may have been different? Like 100 years ago from right now. Ironically, I am still a teacher. Go ahead.
I think it's the way like the students are respecting the teachers now.
Okay,
They're
okay.
respected as support.
Part of it, I do think iPad babies, you gotta watch them, they're shifty. But let me lay this out for you. What if I told you that a huge part of our supply issue with good teachers in the United States is because a huge majority of our history relied on the fact that the only thing a smart, talented woman could be was a teacher up until probably the 1960s or 70s. So that means that we had over 100 years or more in the country of, if you wanted to be any kind of professional as a woman and just do something that had meaning, you had very few choices. And we know motherhood was the default, but teaching, being a good teacher, like there's no coincidence that we see the shift of women kind of breaking the glass ceiling and being able to be in other careers across the spectrum, where like that's never going to change. Like we're not going to be able to go back to where women can only teach, God willing. There's no Handmaid's Tale in our future. And so that poses a very real constraint where like we don't have the same supply, we won't ever have the same supply. So in that context, what do we need to do? And yes, teaching is not a job that's funded appropriately. We know that there's also kind of a selection effect where those schools most in need of state funding are also those schools with the most high need students. And when we think about place effects, right, that community is probably particularly spread thin, and that these schools not only may have trouble just attracting teachers for those considerations, but they're also highly likely to be able to pay those teachers less, even as they're going to be asking their teachers to do so much more. Now, the United States Supreme Court did find that the education is not a right afforded protection under the Constitution. This is where the Department of Education has its nuts on the bandsaw, man, because it's been ruled time and again in the United States that it is not a right afforded protection under the Constitution as it's written, and that local governments are free to choose the levels of educational expenditures in their jurisdictions. That local governments are free to choose, that's going to end up being the operative word perhaps in our own worlds. We're not going to do the group activity today. Instead, we're going to keep talking. Now, I wanted to conclude, we might come back to some of these. These are some fine grained points, but when, this is about 20 years old now, but in roughly half of the states they studied, they showed that the highest poverty school districts were getting fewer resources than the lowest poverty districts, right? Which makes sense, but that gap could actually be up to 2,000 per student. And we think of per pupil expenditures, no matter what the amount is, like that's going to be a huge difference. And they're saying that the highest poverty schools and those that are just the next rung up, lowest poverty, that gap is that severe. And so we're seeing that concentration effect where things are even worse in areas with these multiple overlapping constraints. And that even with that, right, we know that we need to equalize funding, they need to get their resources, but even with resources, all else being equal, that the effectiveness of individual teachers is actually having the hugest impact. One study concluded that we could actually all but eliminate the achievement gap for poor students if we could simply assign them to above average teachers throughout the elementary grades. I personally feel that in my life, that was one of the turning points, or the things that mattered, was having hands down above average teachers who took an interest in a student who they thought could be something. That is not something every teacher does, and not something every student has access to. But for some students, it can make even more of a difference. And we know, obviously, class is a huge part of this. Race is always going to exacerbate it. In California itself, the minority funding gap, at least measured at this time, was almost twice the size of the shortfall for low-income students, which is particularly troubling given the state's large minority population. So that meant that if you were looking at high and low-income students, you're seeing this difference. But if you were then to sort that very same data along racial lines, that there's actually twice the level of inequality and shortfall, right? Now, what are the solutions that have been offered? Reducing reliance on local property taxes. That is obviously a system by design that's going to have this inherent inequality, unless for some reason all of our local properties became equal all of a sudden. That's not probably going to happen either. We could use extra funds to help low-income children in a targeted approach, while at the same time fixing the funding gaps for individual schools within districts. And overall, states could be doing more to fund schools. That schools are still very much at the whim of their local funding base, above and beyond anything else. And so at the same time, they've had a huge host of federal and state kind of expectations go up. They haven't had the corresponding supports. Now, when we think of ways we've tried to intervene, I'm thinking you all may have heard of a couple of these, but I wanted to, we won't watch that one. That one's okay. I was like, some teachers have to pick between groceries and supplies. I would never. I eat. But you know, like especially K through 12, that's like a real thing. And I know in one hand, it's nice to donate, you know, Kleenex and Clorox to your students, or my little brother, you know, I remember they would do those fundraisers and drives. But the idea that a teacher is, you know, buying their own art supplies, and so much of that is placed on teachers, and that instead of making the system better, oh, you can turn those receipts in at tax time. That doesn't help anybody, you know? But that was, I remember that was like laying it on a little thick. I want to bring to you a short description of a really cool program that has pluses and minuses, as all things do. But has anyone here heard of Teach for America? A couple people. Fuck off. Not a lot of people? Oh my God. Okay. I need to be in touch with some people. Not to be like, I guess it's, they recruit in certain places. Now, the thing you really want to watch this video. That's okay. Teach for America is trying to intervene on that point of how important teacher quality can be by targeting and putting high performing people who could very well be working in other occupations in the classrooms where we need them most. And they usually are one of the big things people do after college graduation. So check them out if this resonates. Oops, no, shit. Can I just, oh my God.
Teach for America is a collective force of educators and leaders who are expanding opportunity for all children. We are committed to creating an education system that lets every child reach their potential. But where do we start? We start when a new teacher walks into a classroom. Let's say that teacher is you. You are anxious. This may be the hardest thing you've ever done, but you know this. Education is perhaps the greatest purpose there is. Because everything else, opportunity, progress, freedom, begins with education. You know that every child in that classroom is going to come to you with different needs and gifts and obstacles. And whether you teach 10 or 30 or 120 children, it's your job to do right by all your students every single day for 2 full years. And as you move through those years, you're learning from your peers and listening to parents, celebrating milestones, mourning tragedies. It's quinceañeras and sweet 16s, chorus, after school sports, and student council elections. And with hard work, your students are succeeding academically. They're developing as learners, leaders, and advocates for themselves in pursuit of their goals. And at the end of 2 years, you are also very, very different. Now, you're wondering how you can continue to make an impact on your students' lives. You keep teaching, get a graduate degree, take on a role in the administration of your school. You serve on the school board for the district, then the state. And your impact grows because you keep drawing on what you learned in that first classroom. Fast forward over several decades. Look around at the community you became a part of. Some of you are educators, innovators, state chiefs of education, reimagining schools and school systems to deliver educational excellence for all kids. Some of you are culture makers, leaders in local, state, and federal government, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals who vote, advocate, organize for more equitable policies. You form a network that collectively touches every dimension of the educational experience of children in your community and across this country. We are not just making a 2-year bet. We're making a lifetime bet on our core members, on the alumni they become, and on the world they're shaping. Dr. King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Our work is to find, develop, and support people who are ready to bend that arc of the moral universe alongside their students. It starts with a leader who walks into a classroom, bears witness to the potential of all children, and becomes their advocate for life.
Oh. I haven't seen that forever. It gets me jacked. Now, in the couple minutes we have left, you guys are have a variety of ranges in the class. You all see commercials and things like that. So, what are some things you notice about this? Like, how does it talk about teaching? Or like, how is it trying to get you to even think about Teach for America? What's it kind of pitching this as? Some things that stick out.
Like to create change in the future?
Yes, okay, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. Yes. Did it say anything about how good they're gonna pay you? Did it say anything about how these schools are gonna have the basic supplies you need to accomplish these amazing goals they've set out? In some ways, I would actually say that there is a subtext to this whole commercial, assuming actually we are giving you the reasons to do this because we know you're not going to be paid what you deserve. And we know you're going to be working in a school where doing what we're hoping you can do is really, really hard. And that's why we want you to want to do it. And I'm not trying to shit talk TFA. If anything, if I did a tribal TFA. I went back home and was a guidance counselor on my tribe's res. So it wasn't full TFA, but that idea of like going back home and doing something I completely resonate with. But I also had people I knew that went to TFA, and some of them, I mean, one of them continued to run it for years. She worked her way all the way up in the thing, but most people go on a 2-year assignment, and it's almost like going to war for some of them. It ends up, that's one of the critiques of TFA, that if we have, at least we're trying to get better people into teaching, but it is essentially resigning itself to teaching within certain constraints. And it's also absolving the system of making the changes that it needs to make. And instead saying that teacher quality, if we can just get people to sacrifice from their bone marrow for 2 years at a time, we'll save the babies. That's what we'll do. That is a solution that I hope, as we continue to kind of chew on these different layers over the coming weeks, you can see that this isn't just a structural thing. This isn't just a cultural thing. If we pull either string, the impacts will be complicated and not straightforward, but it's also very much shaped by the things that we even conceive as possible, the problems and the solutions. And so when we have certain paradigms in place about what and how we do things, for example, why is public school important and why do we provide it and whose responsibility is that? These questions and the way we answer them have a uniquely American flavor in this moment that also impacts the way the outcomes are at present. And so when we're thinking of your papers, like I said, schools often are something that we all have some experience with. So feel free to lean into that. And as we come to a close today, next time we're going to keep talking about this idea of teacher quality, school quality, and what are the things inside of a classroom above and beyond the funding and the brick and mortar school that are also impacting student outcomes. I want to say it's all culture, but teachers in many ways are kind of the linchpin between the structure and the culture as it boils down to schooling. So thank you guys. If you're on Zoom, we're going to close the room. If you're in the room, thank you guys. And we'll see each other next time. Yeah, I'll go on mute. If you have questions, just hang around on Zoom, but I'll clear the room first.